A Nation Divided, 1820 to 1865. The slavery debate. The 1800s were a time of growth and success for the United States. Yet the North and the South were very different. The South was made up of farms and plantations where much of the work was done by slaves. The North was an area of small farms and factories where there were no slaves. As new states entered the Union, the North and South argued over whether they would be slave states or free states. By the late 1850s, it was clear that the disagreement over slavery would not be resolved peacefully. The abolitionist movement. Around the 1830s, people known as abolitionists began to speak out against slavery. The abolitionists wanted to free slaves and abolish or end slavery. They felt that slavery was wrong, that no person had the right to own another human being. They also argued that slavery was against the democratic principles on which the nation was founded. They pointed out that the Declaration of Independence stated that all men are created equal, and that all men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Abolitionists said all men included slaves. Some important abolitionists spread their ideas through newspapers. Samuel Cornish published Freedom's Journal, and William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator. Garrison and other abolitionists also formed the National Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. Many of its members traveled throughout the country speaking against slavery. In the timeline below, you'll see 1820 was the Missouri Compromise, 1831, The Liberator published by William Lloyd Garrison, 1833, the National Anti-Slavery Society founded, 1848, the Bill of Women's Rights adopted at Seneca Falls, New York, 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped slavery to freedom, 1850, the Compromise of 1850, 1852 is when Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1857 is when the Dred Scott decision happens in the Supreme Court, in 1858, you have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. More on a few of these later in this reading. Make sure when you answer the questions, you can look back at this timeline as well. The Underground Railroad. Abolitionists helped rescue thousands of slaves through the Underground Railroad, which was neither underground or a railroad, but I digress. This was a system of helping slaves escape from the South into free states or Canada. The railroad was really a network of homes and farms where escaped slaves could go for help or shelter. Code words were used for secrecy. A station was a hiding place. A conductor was the person who guided the slaves to freedom. The Underground Railroad followed a number of routes, but the most heavily traveled one went through Ohio, Indiana, and western Pennsylvania. Next up, we have some people in the abolitionist movement. There you have pictures of Lucretia Mott, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Frederick Douglass. Let's read about them. So John Brown was a white abolitionist who organized an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He planned to distribute the guns stored there to local slaves and start a revolt across the South. He was captured and hanged. Lucretia Coffin Mott was a Philadelphia Quaker minister. She helped organize the National Anti-Slavery Society along with William Lloyd Garrison. Mott became one of the society's most famous speakers. She was also a leader in the struggle for women's right to vote. An abolitionist who was born a slave in Maryland in 1817, Frederick Douglass, escaped to New York in 1838 and settled in Massachusetts. He was a talented speaker who founded the North Star, one of the very first African American abolitionist newspapers. Douglass wrote in 1870, "The simplest truths often meet the sternest resistance and are slowest in getting general acceptance." Harriet Beecher Stowe, a teacher and the wife of a minister, wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. It's about a cruel slaveholder named Simon Legree, who whipped Tom, a slave, so badly that he died. The book became a bestseller and convinced many people that slavery should end. Until she was about 30 years old, Sojourner Truth was a slave in New York. When all the slaves in New York State were freed in 1827, she traveled the country speaking against slavery. Once, when a man told her that he did not care about her speeches any more than he cared about a flea bite, she replied, "Maybe not, but the Lord willing, I'll keep you scratching." When Harriet Tubman was 28 years old, she ran away from a Maryland plantation where she was a slave. She became one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad, guiding more than 300 slaves to freedom. Slaveholders offered a reward of $40,000 for her capture. Tubman said, "On my Underground Railroad, I never run my train off the track, and I've never lost a passenger." Page 3. The Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1820. The plantations that grew rice, cotton, sugar, and other crops in the South depended on the work of slaves. To make sure that slavery would continue, the South demanded that it would be allowed in new Western states entering the Union. When the Missouri Territory applied for admission to the Union in 1819, it applied as a slave state. Missouri's admission would give the South control of the Senate, since there would be 12 slave states to 11 free states. Northern congressmen opposed admitting another slave state. They proposed that Congress abolish slavery in Missouri. This set off a bitter argument between Northerners and Southerners in Congress. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky was called the Great Compromiser. A compromise, a way of settling a disagreement by getting each side to settle for less than it was. He worked out a solution that kept the number of slave states equal to the number of free states. Let's take a look. The Missouri Compromise. Number 1, Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. Number 2, Maine entered the Union as a free state. There's Maine, here's Missouri. Number 3 of the compromise, except in Missouri, slavery was banned in all other territories gained in the Louisiana Purchase, north of Missouri's southern border. So you got this line here, and everything up here, when it turns its state, is going to be a free states, and anything below this line, when they become a state, they will be slave states. The Compromise of 1850 called for Maine. The Compromise. This is cut off. Called for Maine and Missouri to enter the Union. All right, I just explained it to you, so I'm sorry. So once again, Missouri becomes a slave state right here. Maine over here enters as a free state, and in the future, any states that come to be above this line are free states, and below this are slave states. This is still all Spanish territory here, and this is Oregon country. Page 4. A nation divided. Oh. The Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 included land deals and a stronger version of the Fugitive Slave Act. Let's read. Let's see what we got here. The Compromise of 1850. In 1850, Congress had decided if California would join the Union as a free or slave state. It also had to decide whether the rest of the territory won in the Mexican War would be free or not. Once again, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, along with Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois and Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, came up with a compromise. The Compromise of 1850. California would become a free state. The rest of the Mexican territory was divided into New Mexico and Utah. Each state could decide whether to be a slave state or free state. Texas gave up part of its territory to create New Mexico. There's your map up here. New Mexican territory, Utah territory. California's cut off, but that's right there. It was now against the law to buy and sell slaves in Washington, D.C., but not to own slaves. That's part of the Compromise of 1850. And then the Fugitive Slave Act made it legal for slave owners to go after and capture runaway slaves who had escaped to the North. The Dred Scott decision. In 1857, there was an important national debate over slavery. Dred Scott and his wife, Harriet, were slaves from Missouri who had moved with their master's family to the free state of Illinois. Later, they all moved back to Missouri, a slave state. Scott went to court to sue for his freedom. Scott claimed that having lived in a free state made him free. The case went before the Supreme Court. Abolitionists paid Scott's legal fees, and leading abolitionist lawyers argued his case. They wanted to test the legal bounds of slavery, and they were disappointed. The Supreme Court ruled that Scott could not sue for his freedom because he was property, not a citizen. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, wrote that Scott had no rights which any white man was bound to respect. Most Southerners were pleased with the decision. Northern anti-slavery groups were enraged. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the 1858 U.S. Senate race, Republican Abraham Lincoln of Illinois ran against Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who was up for re-election. Lincoln was unknown. On the night he received the Republican nomination, Lincoln gave a speech in support of the Union. In it, he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe that this government cannot last as long as America is half slave and half free." He then challenged the pro-slavery Douglas to a series of 7 debates. In a debate, 2 sides argue for or against an issue. The debates between Lincoln and Douglas drew large crowds and national attention. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race, his performances made him famous throughout the nation. He narrowly defeated Douglas to become president 2 years later. It's a picture of Lincoln at the podium during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Slavery in the United States of America. 200 years ago, slavery was legal in the United States. Slaves were shipped from Africa to work in plantations in the southern states. They produced cotton and tobacco and other goods. Here's your slave states. The whip was the most common punishment for escapers. The whip has a leather thong attached to an iron chain. This is a pronged neck ring. A slave who wore such a device could not even lie down to sleep. Look at that. These hooks were designed to catch in brambles and branches and prevent slaves from escaping. Here's a picture of a slave auction in New Orleans, where human beings were sold as slaves, just like cattle at the market. Slaves were regarded as property and could be sold, like a piece of furniture or a house. Slaves who ran away and were recaptured faced cruel punishments, some of which are shown here. Slavery was abolished in the USA in 1865 following the American Civil War between northern and southern states. Around 4 million slaves were freed. This headpiece was hung with bells, which would make a furtive escape almost impossible. Slaves were sometimes branded with the initials of their owner, like farm animals are today. This would be on the end of a metal prod. They would heat this up till it was glowing red, and then push it into the flesh of the slave to sear in the mark. That's what branding is. So that would show ownership of that slave. Most slave houses were simple wooden shacks with few comforts. The end.